Welcome to the MarTech Matrix, the podcast that cogently uncovers the business problems each tech company was built to solve. Today, Sean speaks with Nick Stoltz, the Chief Strategy Officer at Measured, a media optimization platform powered by incrementality intelligence. They work with brands like Beyond, Saks Off 5th, and Lance Plus. They will be discussing how incrementality measurement can be used to optimize a brand's media strategy and what the future of measurement looks like with cookies going away. After the show, head on over to themartechmatrix.com for show notes, contact information, and details on upcoming episodes. Now, get ready to enter the Matrix.
Nick Stoltz, welcome into the Matrix. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, we're excited to have you here. And we're going to beat you up a little bit because measurement is one of those conversations that people are excited to have, but there's a lot of eye rolling, a lot of frustration. I was buying media back in the mid 90s, and obviously back then there was nothing. We took everybody got their word for it, and I talked to sales reps later on, and they just made stuff up. Not to say that's happening today. I think we've had a lot of technology advances since those days, primarily around MTA and cookies and whatnot, and a lot of that's going away. Obviously, that's why solutions like Measured are cropping up. It's a very noisy space. So, give a brief introduction of yourself and the company and how you came to be at Measured, and then we'll dive into what is the business problem Measured set out to solve, and then how that's evolved.
Yeah, I mean, you teed it up. I think it was actually a nice way to sort of think about this. It's not just a confusing space. It's a difficult problem to solve. And I started tackling this problem. I got into this space in 2009. Back then we were dealing with very large Fortune 100 brands like the Home Depot or Citi, who were trying to understand, hey, previously I had nothing. How does paid media drive in-store sales across all these product categories? Or how does it drive how I acquire customers with checking accounts and things like that? The space has evolved, I think, in the last 15 years in a way that's great for consumers, right? And great for consumer brands because, 10 or 15 years ago, you had a fashion company or a lifestyle brand or things like that. You had to spend all of your time paying for shelf space in a store. You had to cut a retail wholesale deal with Saks to get your clothes there. You had to subsidize Home Depot's marketing to get your products on their shelf, right? Something changed in the past 10 years. You could now sell to brands directly on the internet, and you kind of forget how much internet shopping behavior has really changed in the past 10 years. You could actually introduce yourself to brands via things like Facebook and Instagram and Google search and open web display and all these things that didn't exist anymore. And I think it created a boon for consumers and consumer brands because there was so much more opportunity to try out brands and things like that didn't exist before. But it also made things really confusing because you're serving all these ads, you're trying to track people across devices and sites and walled gardens and open web and all this sort of stuff. And you get all these very confusing signals driven by cookies and trying to understand what your marketing is doing. And it's the exact opposite of what you mentioned in the 90s. Like, hey, we just kind of have to trust this works because I'm seeing sales coming out the other side. Brands had the other problem. You're chasing clicks and you're chasing like user level behavior and all this sort of stuff. And at some point between the walled gardens, between the rise of the privacy era, which I think is overdue and welcome, it became so convoluted to understand, like, what's the ground truth out there, right? And so, where Measured is lining up, it's the same old problem. Like, what is my marketing doing? Where is it driving value? How do I use that not as a cost center? I mean, marketing has always been looked at as a cost center. How do we turn this into a value center that drives growth and drives meaningful impact for the brand in ways that we know happen out there? That's the problem we want to unlock for brands. We're specifically doing it with incrementality. We can talk about what that means, but we're jumping into something that has become more and more and more complex, and the underlying problem is as hard as it was, if not more difficult than when you were buying media in the 90s.
Yeah, look, when I was buying media in the 90s, I don't even think there was e-commerce. I mean, I was working on Internet Explorer 2.0. I'll date myself there. And it was just downloads. Everything was about downloads and tech, and it wasn't about commerce. And the media world, I think what you're talking about is the fragmentation of consumer behavior, right? Back then, you went to Yahoo and you went to your portal and you read your news. You went to my Yahoo, Yahoo, and you read your news, and you didn't really go far, right? And I was laughing thinking about this. Like, I saw a quote last week on LinkedIn. I saw the quote from John Wanamaker that almost everybody in this business should be familiar with about, I'm wasting half my money, but I don't know which half. He said that at a time when, what were his media options? I mean, he probably did some print, some newspapers, maybe some out of home. There wasn't
Flyers.
TV. There wasn't, I don't even know if there was radio back then, when he said that comment, right? So, I can't imagine his head would explode today if he could come back and see the number of channels that brands advertise on, and then to try and figure out where he's wasting his money. This is always the problem that people are trying to solve for. So how does measured solve for that problem? But before we do that, I want the listeners to understand who this is right for, because I think that fragmentation piece is key. Who is the ideal customer for measured? In other words, who's going to get the most value out of what you do?
Yeah, so we work primarily with consumer brands. We work with brands in the retail space, so fashion, home goods, lifestyle brands. We work with brands in the technology space, some in financial services, but primarily brands that are selling their products to consumers through channels that they own, whether that's e-commerce, whether that's an app that they own, whether that's first-party retail. That's the problem that we line up to solve. Brands that are spending, generally speaking, north of 10 million per year in paid media are all the way up to hundreds and hundreds of millions of some of the brands that we work with are great fits for measured, and we're solving the problem we just talked about for brands like that.
Okay, so $10 million, multiple channels. I was thinking, going back to those days where I was buying, it was, we had to come up with a way to measure, right? And so clicks naturally rose up because it was something different, but it was, specific to digital. And my former colleagues and I joke around how we probably made a really big mistake that's still having an impact on the industry, because clicks probably aren't the best or the most fair way to measure success of a campaign, because none of us clicked, right? But we were influenced by it, right? But how do you measure that? And then there became the view through, and then people were like, well, really? So they saw 5 ads on 5 different vendors. Which one or publishers, which one do you give the credit to? So how do you think about, that evolution from the click-based, it's like click buy, to the fragmentation you mentioned earlier? People are exposed to all this messaging, whether it's multiple publishers online or out of home or TV or radio or audio, whatever it might be. How do you think about who gets credit for that?
Yeah, and look, we can go back. You brought up the Wanamaker example, right? So you go back to the problem there, and I think it's still ultimately the same problem, right? It's like, hey, you've maybe got outdoor. You've got, how did you hear about me from friends? What was your experience last time? Maybe you're giving out, promotional flyers and circulars. Maybe you have folks out on the street handing out kind of flyers come in. How do you sort of think about where all of that kind of fits in the consumer decision cycle and their intent and awareness? And I think one of the things that becomes obvious with clicks is a lot of those clicks, the equivalent you could say is like, well, what if I was standing at the front door of one of John Wanamaker's stores and handing someone a 10% off flyer as they walk in the door? Was that driving the sale, or was this person already on their way in the door, right? And this is kind of the fundamental question around incrementality. It's, you look at that fragmentation of media, and then you look where it is served across the awareness, intent, purchase, repurchase decision cycle. And it's pretty complicated to understand whether the media that I just served really and truly incrementally drove that sale, or whether it was just along for the ride. And you think about, you make the simple kind of, the metaphor or comparison of handing someone a flyer walking in the door. I mean, Google and Meta and all of these companies are extremely good at sussing out who has high intent to purchase. I'm going to show them an ad. And the way those algorithms are optimized and the way they're built, it's not to serve an ad that is going to change the outcome. That's not what they try to suss out. It's to serve an ad to someone who will buy. Whether they were going to buy anyways or whether you made them buy, they don't care, right? And that's kind of the fundamental problem with chasing those clicks and chasing those impressions. How do you know whether the paid search click that you got just before purchase was something that drove that sale, or whether someone would have found you anyways because they heard about you from a friend or saw you on a connected TV, ad, 30 days ago or things like that. And that's where the problem has become, the data that we have, the signals that we have, the computing power and modeling techniques that we have made, like, they've exploded our opportunities as a marketer compared to some of the stuff we were talking about in the 90s, but it's also made it incredibly complex to understand what's signal and what's noise, what's correlated, but what's causal, right? And that's the problem that we're setting out to solve. And I would say that if you think about all of the kind of techniques that exist out there in the space that are driven by data and modeling and great data science, we're bringing those to the table. We're also giving marketers the ability to understand incrementality and to feed those things with incrementality. And what does that mean? That means that I need to be able to put out an in-market incrementality experiment, test and control. Okay, I'm going to set out test groups. I'm going to set out control groups. Those control groups are going to see, they're my kind of business as usual group. Those test groups, I'm going to, hey, I might push in with advertisement. I might pull out, Facebook advertising and say, hey, how many sales go away when I do that? That sort of ground truth and the ability to run those experiments at the frequency and agility and scale that you need to be able to power all of those kind of marketing science techniques and data-driven techniques for understand your marketing. That's where Measured has been out front in the category for 7 years now.
So maybe you answer this, but I'm going to ask it a different way. How do you ensure that a channel isn't penalized or not given credit when they're a part of the influence, right? So I'll give you an example. I might see a billboard, right, digital or out of home, or even just a static out of home ad. And then I come home and I see a TV ad. Maybe on the way I heard an audio ad, right? And then I'm on Facebook and I see an ad and I click. How do we ensure that the out of home ad, gets some credit? They didn't get all of it, right? It was reinforced by other channels for sure. But how do you make sure that doesn't get overlooked?
Yeah, so that's the real kind of rub here, right? Because you got a couple different signals to go through this, right? And they're biased and they don't work the same across all these channels. So you mentioned, hey, like for digital channels and targetable channels, I can sometimes see I served an impression, I served a click, and then this person converted. For out of home, you don't really have that luxury, right? You don't know if someone saw an ad. So traditionally, you might look at a data-driven exercise, right? So if I look at my sales historically, and I look at places where I'm spending it out of home, or time periods where I've spent more or less into out of home, do I see sales move together with those things, right? This is the sort of modeling approach to marketing effectiveness. You build a big model, you put your marketing inputs, some other inputs, and you try to describe how these things impact sales outcomes. Which, look, it starts to try to get at some of the questions that you were talking about. But it has a challenge, right? Like, models can't tell if things are correlated or causal, right? Like you mentioned Wanamaker. The other great example people always bring up is, like, if you told one of these models what causes shark bites, the model would tell you ice cream sales drive shark bites, right? Because whenever ice cream sales go up, shark bites are correlated with that. Well, it's like, okay, ice cream doesn't cause shark bites, and we laugh at that dumb example. But if you're just looking at the data, when do shark attacks happen? In summer months when people are at the beach and things like that. Well, when do ice cream sales happen, right?
Sure.
But a model can't tell you that this caused this. It'll tell you that, hey, it looks like these things kind of move together, right? And that's the things that we've worked with historically. Now, where Measured would use those approaches, but I think supplement, enhance, and frankly take them to another level, is like, look, let's run an experiment, right? And I'll use the ice cream sale. Let's just keep going with this ice cream sales example. Like, what if I physically shut down the ice cream stores in, 10% of the beaches across the country? And I said, hey, did shark bites still happen, right? Or did they still happen at the same frequency?
Sure.
And guess what? If I did that experiment, I'd probably say, hey, you know what? The frequency of shark attacks is the exact same in these 10% of beaches where I stopped selling ice cream as it is in the other 90% where I'm selling it. Would suggest to me that ice cream sales aren't driving this behavior, right? Now, well, in the real world, right, like this is actually something that is challenging to do, and the data science is sophisticated, and there's also some challenges around doing this at scale, but we've built a lot of product that allows people to automate these experiments. Hey, I'm going to take 10% of my audience. I'm actually just going to not serve them branded search clicks. Now, some of those people, guess what? A good amount of those people, they're going to find the website anyways, and they're going to purchase anyways. Some of those people might not happen to navigate to the site. Some of those people might be served conquesting ads from your competitors, and they might click on those ads and go elsewhere. But the only way you're going to really understand that is if you design an experiment, you create that test group and that control group, and you carefully watch how many of those sales went away. And if you have that information, if you have that ground truth, then all those other things that we're talking about, it gives you a much better sense of like, well, how do I understand them, right? Because those experiment observations can be used to train, inform, update those models, and making sure that you're not kind of getting into this mirage of, yeah, I know I see a lot of clicks. I know those things are really correlated with sales, but are they driving, right? And look, the short answer is a lot of the time they are, but a meaningful amount of the time they aren't.
How do you, so if you're a brand, and let's say you're working in 5 channels, right? Doesn't matter what 5. And you want to see which channels are driving the most incrementality. Do you like take a small group and remove one channel at a time? Maybe it's 3 channels that are driving maybe it's 4, maybe it's 2, maybe it's just 1. Like how many, I guess the question is, how many experiments should a brand expect to have to run over a period of time in order to understand what it is they're trying to understand, which is the incrementality of each channel?
This is a great question. And I think it's actually kind of an opportunity to change the way that brands maybe think about this, right? So there's a pathway to this, right? And where you start is probably going through those 5 channels and saying, look, I'm going to do a holdout test for each of those channels. Let's just go one by one. Let's kind of understand them. And that's great. And that's probably where you start, because that's where you want to get an important answer to kind of say, hey, I understand what this channel's doing. I'm training my models, all that sort of good stuff. But I think, if you stop there, you're going to be really missing out on what I think the bigger picture value of this is. And to me, that those initial set of experiments, you're going to learn a lot of really interesting things. You're going to answer a lot of really important questions, but it's also probably going to unlock some even more complicated questions and some even more higher value questions where, hey, you come out of that question, you say, hey, this one isn't performing quite the way I expected. Maybe I need to go in and kind of tweak who I'm talking to, what I'm serving. Let's run it again. Or maybe it unlocks questions about, maybe I want to understand how channel A and channel B work together, Google and Meta, for example. Maybe it lends you the question of saying, okay, I understand how that's driving total sales, but maybe I want to go in and look specifically at how this channel is driving new customer acquisition, or specifically new customer acquisition in this specific product category or offering that I know has a higher lifetime value. So you start thinking about what does this become? It becomes a muscle. It becomes, I like to think of it as a culture of experimentation, right? Where you build a culture, you maintain a learning agenda, right? You run a set of experiments. I like to think of it, as I call it a hypothesis framework. Like, look, I have business questions. Those can be strategic. They can be very tactical. What does brand search do? But they can be very strategic. Like, what channels or what product offerings acquire the customers that I know are, more profitable for my business? Those types of questions feed a learning agenda that I think it builds on itself, right? So quarter on quarter on quarter, as you continue to unpack this, as you continue to pull the thread, as the landscape changes, as your competitive offering changes, as your brand messaging and strategy change, this is like a superpower that I think pays compounding dividends if you can actually build it into this sort of, this, like I said, this culture of experimentation where, hey, we're going to be data driven, we're going to be hypothesis driven, and we're going to put real world tests out there that drive us towards, growing value, growing brand value, acquiring better customers, new customers, things like that. I do think as the world gets more complicated, as brands talk to each other in the same channels and kind of fight over, what is thinner and thinner margins in the infinite consumer choice we have out there, I think this is one of the remaining real kind of competitive advantages that brands have that aren't based on the kind of like size and advantages that we see in the news that Apple and Google are getting taken after and things like this, right? I mean, this is a way for you to build a real world competitive advantage that will drive your brand. And look, not everybody's doing this stuff, and that's the way that I like to think about how this goes from, hey, I want to answer a question to I want to create a superpower.
Yeah, just data is turning Davids into Goliath, right? You can win on data. You don't have to necessarily be the biggest one. And I like the idea of continuous experiments. And do your clients also come back and sort of redo the same experiments over and over? Because things change, right? Like new competition, pandemic, right? There's always something happening in the world that can impact their business. So it's not just like, oh, I learned this, move on to the next one. Imagine you have to come back on a regular cadence.
Yeah. So the sophisticated brands are kind of have there's typically three buckets that I like to think about, right? So there's tactical testing that's going to kind of feed our modeling that we just go in and do 2 to 4 times a year across your big channels, right? I mean, look, stuff changes, strategy changes. We're just on a calendar there, and we can automate a lot of that, which I think makes it really powerful. There's a second bucket where, look, I call it the triggered experiment, right? Something endogenous, something exogenous to the business has changed, and we just need to go out there and figure out what's going on, right? Whether that's a new strategy, whether that's a new product offering, whether it's something going on in the competitive landscape, whether it's something like, giant that it impacts the entire industry, like iOS or COVID or something like that. Sometimes you just know, I got to get it back out there and test something, right? The world changes a lot more quickly than, the data changes and my models can kind of pick up on the signal. And then there's the third bucket where it's like, hey, how am I using testing to get out there and answer like really meaty strategic business questions, right? Because one of the great things about testing that you can't do with these sort of data-driven modeling things is that you can't prove a negative. I don't have any data on how this new strategy is going to work because I haven't tried it out yet. But what I can do is I can go out and test out that strategy. I can see how it plays out, and I can get a sense for whether it's net accretive or positive or not before I actually put it out there and get any data and see what happens, right? So that third bucket is where we really push brands to line testing up against their biggest strategic business questions, because I love to go in and talk to CMOs and say, hey, what's keeping you up at night? What's your biggest opportunity in the next 6 months? Where are your biggest threats? And when I hear them talk, I say, you know what, that thing you just brought up there, that's a testable hypothesis. That's something we can go out and test. You just told me that you thought if you could make a case for a $10 million, upper funnel, reach-based awareness campaign, and you could put it on top of all the stuff you're doing, that you would drive the best, Q4 holiday that you've seen in 10 years. It's like, okay, like, let's go out and let's go test that, right? Like, let's take a portion of the country, let's implement that strategy. Let's see how effectively that works, right? And then let's use that to make a case to finance, to make a case to the board, to get those budgets, because we've got data that tells you it's a game changer for us.
That's smart. How long do these experiments take for a brand to get usable data, something they can say, okay, we're going to go lean into this or pull out of that based on the data?
Yeah, our typical experimentation period is about 4 weeks, right? So we build, and what Measure does is automate a lot of the kind of heft around the data science and kind of pushing these things out, and allows you to get these things out very quickly and at scale. We typically will put them in market for about 4 weeks. That would be the average. Now, sometimes you want to run these tests a little longer. Maybe you're looking at how you really kind of drive consumer behavior further up the funnel. And so maybe you want to extend that out to say 8 weeks to answer certain questions. But I'd say the typical is 4. The maximum we tend to do are 8-week experiments. Like if we're not seeing pretty clear and compelling evidence by then, we don't find that it moves much past that. But that's what we're looking at. And because of the way we set this up and the way we automate this stuff, brands might be able to run 3 or 4 of these 4-week experiments at any given time. And that gives you a lot of opportunity throughout the year. If you think about doing, hey, I've got 8-week sprints where I'm running 3-4 experiments at a time, that adds up over the course of the year. That's a lot of learnings.
Yeah, for sure. Where does creative fit in? Like, how does it impact the testing? I guess if it's apples to apples, if they're using the same bad creative everywhere, then you're going to get the same results. But at the same time, the right creative for the right user on the right platform could be crucial to performance. And how do you ensure that you're not making media decisions based on the wrong messaging?
Yeah, and this is where it all kind of comes together, right? Because what you tend to do is like, look, I'm going to bring a message to a portion of the audience, and that portion of the audience is usually at a specific place in the journey, right? For a lot of channels, hey, I'm going to target people who have never purchased before. I'm going to target people who have been to the site but not purchased. I'm going to target someone who's already purchased from me. You tend to kind of bring them a message with that targeting with a certain channel, right? So that is all kind of part of how you reach the consumer and how you ultimately influence their decision. So I think a lot of the testing that we do is sort of inclusive of those things. Now, where we can and have done a lot of testing is, look, what creative strategy, what creative format is best at this point in the funnel, right? Like we see a lot of evidence that the further you go up the funnel, the more you want to use, brand images and video and things like that, as opposed to, catalog or product ads or things like that, right? And the answer can be different for different brands. So we don't use this technique to kind of say, hey, do you like image A or image B? Do you like the purple? Do you like the green? That's really kind of the place for traditional sort of A/B type testing. We're more thinking about what is the strategy? What is the messaging? Is a promo in? Is a promo not? What's the ad format? And comparing those types of things and comparing how do you sort of optimize that strategy for different channels, targeting different audiences at different points in the funnel. So I think of it a little bit more strategic than creative A versus creative B.
Yeah, in one of our more recent episodes, we had Ben Shea on from SignUpBox, and they're sort of modernizing that sort of A/B testing, sort of what you would do in a focus group, but online. And I think we were saying is go there first, test your creative messaging against your target audience with context around the platform, and then do your media experiments. That makes what I was thinking about when I asked the question, and maybe I should be more clear, is I've heard people, I'll ask someone about audio advertising or CTV, and I'll get a response like, oh, we tried it, it didn't work. And then I'll ask a follow-up question like, well, okay, how targeted did you get? Because that's the power of those two channels, right? You can get really specific on content, on audience, on creative, on messaging. Like there's a lot of things you can do. Oh, no, we just did a generic message, like more of like a branding message, but the performance wasn't there. I'm thinking, okay, but you didn't use the channel right. So you can't judge the whole channel based on the fact that you didn't know how to test properly. Do you get a lot of brands coming to you going, this is how we used to do it, now we need a better way?
Yeah, and it's even funnier, like when you said, I hear that a lot, like we tried it and it didn't work. And oftentimes I'll ask, like, based on what? Like, what is the conclusion that you came to that it didn't work? And the answer is often like, well, it didn't work. Like we didn't see it. It's like, and it's funny, like things like podcast or even CTV, like, well, did you see those people come in through branded search? Like, did they, obviously they're not going to tell you purchase, maybe you did a post-purchase survey and a few of them said that they heard you on the podcast, but adding those new channels specifically can be incredibly difficult. Like, how much are you spending on that new channel? Like, is it a drop in the bucket? Oh, we did it for 4 weeks in the middle of our high season. Well, while we were spending on everything else with all the other messages, maybe it actually was incredibly effective and you just didn't notice it.
Yeah.
right? Like, so this is where I think you can, use this sort of concerted test to kind of say, well, if you're going to try out a channel, let's sort of set it up in a way where, we're going to prove out whether we're going to move the needle on this or not. We're going to actually have a group that doesn't get these ads. We're going to have a group that gets them. Like, I want to see an actual lift, and I want to spend enough on the group that's seeing them to potentially essentially simulate what might be a much larger national budget, or what would be really risky. Like, I'm not going to go out with $1 million in podcasts when I've never tried it before, but I might be willing to take 50K and target a very small portion of the audience and see if I get a bump there. New channels can be tough, right? Because if you're not seeing that lift, the question becomes, did it happen and I couldn't figure it out? If you build a true experiment and you see that lift, fantastic. If you don't, the question then becomes, is this a bad fit? Am I reaching the wrong people? Am I giving them the wrong message? Sometimes you might need to go back to the well and try again, and things like that. I think we give folks the opportunity to do that in a much more structured way.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, look, if you can't drive lift in a channel, what do we think is going on there? That's, you got to kind of unpack, and you got to use your managerial hat a little bit and things like that to really kind of understand, is it who I'm talking to? Is it what I'm saying? Is it those sorts of things? But it gives you the opportunity to go deeper on it.
Yeah. And when they say they're using QR code engagement, or the codes that we set in the show as their primary measurement, then you have your job cut out for you, and you got to back up a little bit and train them on what to measure, because you get a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think it's like clicks or impressions or anything else, right? Seeing a signal, I'd rather see a signal than no signal. But what I need to do is go out and verify, like, look, is that signal real, right? Like, is it real? Is somebody redeeming that QR code? Did they find that online, or did they really listen to the audio and said, hey, I want to try this out? And look, a promotional way to get into a brand, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's so much signal out there that if you don't have a method to understand, like, look, what does this signal mean? How real is it? Is this correlated? Is it causal? Is it noise? Like, that's what I think incrementality gives you the opportunity to have a real plan of attack, right? And a plan of attack and a tool in the tool belt to suss this stuff out, it puts you at an advantage. And if you're not thinking about it, I would argue some of your competitors are. And that's where that advantage comes from.
What do you say to a brand that says we do A/B tests, or we do holdout tests, or we do geo tests, but we do them in platform? So I do it on Meta, I do it on TikTok, I do it on Google. What do you say to those people? Because they seem to be leaning into trusting the platform, which is ironic that they're going to trust all the platforms you shouldn't trust. How do you talk to them?
Yeah, I'm not 100% anti. And I'll say it for this reason. Facebook conversion lift gave a lot of marketers their first introduction to incrementality and test and control and things like that. It was a very good product. It was one of the first products in the industry where, like, hey, you do it in their UI, and they give you a read, and it's not a sales presentation. I mean, you go back in the old days, sales teams would come in and give you the presentations of the outputs of your lift. Like, oh, you saw millions of dollars of lift. It's like, you're giving me a sales presentation. So I think they're good. I think it's a good way to kind of explore them. Now, there are some challenges with them that I think marketers need to be aware of. iOS 14.5 and a lot of the tracking challenges broke these things. Some of the platforms have worked very hard to be able to bring that capability back, but they need a lot of signal net of that loss. You can't really suss out, am I getting an Android heavy audience because of opt-out and things like that? So they're useful, but all of them are kind of built differently. That they vary from platform to platform to platform. It's kind of a black box. If something changes again out there, they could break again, and you could be left out in the cold without a solution that you own. They're useful, but if they're the only thing you're relying on, I think you're probably just doing that to really just get accustomed to, okay, what is this stuff? How does it work? How do I get comfortable with it? Brands that are really going to drive value with this and drive it in the way that we were kind of talking about as an organizational muscle, They need a way to do this on an apples to apples basis across their channels, across their media mix. They need a way to control it. Like, hey, this is a first party, this is a first party capability that I own that isn't, relying on the platforms. So I tend to approach it more from that perspective and less from the, hey, should we let them be grading their own homework, which that's a tough one too. I think you can get a little bit more comfortable with that in some of these places. The problem for me is like, look, as a brand, I've got to own this, and I've got to be able to own it in a way that I know is consistent across channels. And look, if I can go in, and we do this a lot, we'll go in and validate an answer that you're seeing on conversion lift. If those things line up, great. I know this is a tool that I can use and I can set it loose on certain problems, and it can be a part of the tool belt. But if it's the only thing you have, I do think it's not going to be as effective as you'd like it to be. So I encourage brands to use it to explore the concept of incrementality, but then kind of inform like, well, what's my scalable strategy that I'm going to use to drive value?
That's good advice. All right, let's pivot a little bit here. Earlier, we talked about ideal customer being, multiple channels, $10 million a year in ad spend. Can you give us an example of a client that sort of fits the mold? So no outliers. The situation they came to you with, how you addressed it, and then what the result of the work that Measure did provided the brand. In other words, what did the brand do with what you shared with them or what they learned from you, and how did it impact their bottom line or their revenue?
Yeah, so I was actually just on site with one of our brands this week, the William Carter Company. It's a very well-known children's apparel clothing retailer.
This is Carter's?
Yeah, this is Carter's.
Okay.
So as someone with 3 kids, there's a lot of Carters being bought in my household. So, they brought us in specifically with this problem. This is a big brand. They sell a lot in e-commerce. They have a very large retail presence. They were sitting in a place where it's like, hey, we've got Adobe Analytics on our site, and it tells us all these clicks are the most valuable thing ever. We've got a mixed model, that we run once a quarter, and it kind of comes in and it gives us a view. But, we have a lot of kind of day-to-day questions. Is what we're seeing in Adobe Analytics, is it real? The mixed model is pretty high level. We see it once a quarter. We get some directional insights there, but it's really hard for us to kind of, manage the brand on that. They really wanted to kind of understand, like, look, across all of the media, across all of the, you can think about, the way that brand works, and people get pregnant, they're having a kid, that's like, oh, Carter's, I got to buy baby clothes, stuff like that. They want to bring people into that brand. They want to keep them around as those children go from, infant to toddler to, to school age and things like that. It's a pretty complex cycle about how they talk to folks. There's also big seasonality. Back to school and holiday, as you can imagine, are really big there. So we kind of came into that setting. We started working across a number of teams, and we started going in and kind of asking the question, like, look, what are these media channels doing? And let's start going through the sort of, holdout testing for our biggest channels that makes sense to start. But let's do this, and let's look at the impact of that media, not just online, but also in store. Like, I've got to understand in an omni-channel way how these things are driving. And we saw some very interesting things. We went in and tested. They do a lot of advertising on Meta across Facebook and Instagram, as you can imagine. We found that, hey, when you go in and do an experiment, Meta is a lot more effective than Adobe gives it credit for. Shocker, right? Because Adobe doesn't really see any of those impressions. They just get some signal from people that actually click through and buy the ads pretty immediately, right? Now, Facebook also has a very, robust signal because of all the data that you give them and all the data they have on their side about, hey, here are all the people I served an impression to. Here are all the people that clicked. Here's all those people that then converted within a week. I'm going to take credit for all of them. Well, guess what? Not all of those deserve credit. The real answer was somewhere in between. And getting that number in a really, confirmed way was illuminating for the brand, right? And it didn't really line up with anything exactly what they see, but it confirmed a lot of opinions. Like, look, it's probably not as good as Facebook tells me, probably a lot better than Adobe tells me. It unlocked some other interesting things, right? Like, Meta drives, and again, not surprising. They weren't doing a lot of like store traffic based campaigns or things like that. Meta was driving about 90% of its impact online versus in store. And net of that, they were seeing a great return on their Meta spend. We did the same thing for Google, and it was a similar story. A lot of their shopping ads and PMax placements and things like that, they were, a lot more effective than Adobe was getting credit, not as effective as Google. The interesting one there is that those campaigns were driving almost as much value on the site as they were on the store. Those two things were actually producing very solid returns in very different ways. And the thing that they were really missing on the Google side was how much of the in-store impact they were driving, right? So, you think with Google ads, like, look, I do see a lot of clicks. I've got to verify whether they're incremental, but I might not have as much insight into how people use, Google search or Google shopping to drive in-store behavior, right? So we're now not just understanding the impact, but allocating these dollars across, our omni-channel impact, and not just in store and not just the click signal and things like that. So that was pretty valuable to just get those answers pretty definitively with very, statistically high statistical significance and stuff like that. So that was great. But it allowed us to go a bit deeper, right? Because the tests also unlocked some insights into how they were setting up some of those campaigns, especially on Facebook, right? Facebook has a lot of complex ad products. They just introduced one called Advantage Shopping that's AI driven. What they were finding was that, hey, a lot of these things, we might have a little bit more audience overlap than we thought. And these things might be serving ads a little further down the funnel than we thought. A little more to retargeting audiences, a little bit more to retention audiences, a little bit less to the sort of more high value, more incremental, new to brand type folks. So we actually used some of the details from the holdout tests that I mentioned to go in and update some of the audience targeting and campaign deployment to more align to the marketing strategy that they wanted to prioritize, which is customer acquisition. So that gave us the opportunity to go in, make some of those changes. We're actually going to go out and do some retesting there. So this now that you start talking about, and look, a lot of this work started in the past 3 months. I think we launched our first test with them in January. We're now starting to kind of line up and go from, media channel holdout testing and things like that to how might we use this to explore back to school strategy, right? And how we build the mix and, awareness versus, mid and lower funnel marketing. How does that apply to back to school? What might we learn at back to school that we could use to optimize holiday budgets? So understanding those channels and then starting to build roadmaps as you get into the most important part of their year, right? Like back to school followed by holiday. There are big opportunities not to just, update, quantify what we're doing, reallocate some budgets net of that, start, going in and making some campaign and audience and messaging changes that align better to the intended marketing strategy, but also then getting out there and testing out real world. How can I increase sales by meaningful amounts in the moments that matter for my brand? So I think that's a very typical type story that we go through with brands. I mean, hopefully it sounds like the kind of stuff we talked up top where you kind of start simple and you build and build and build. And all of a sudden, like what we're trying to do here is build a superpower. And, look, Carter's is a great organization and they're really data driven and they have experience with testing in the org. So we've been able to move really fast and drive value there. And I love doing that work. I love going on site with folks and having those convos and hearing that impact and stuff like that, because it can really move the needle quickly for brands.
So I think we heard about how you can evolve your tests over a period of time. Obviously, the relationship builds and grows and people become more open. What does it take for a listener who fits the criteria? What does it take for them to get started? Like, what does that process look like from an onboarding to I'm running tests, I'm getting results, and I'm actually seeing an impact?
Yeah. So look, time to value is extremely important for me. It's extremely important for Measured and extremely important for us because it's important for our brands. So a lot of the product that we have built really tries to press the gas pedal on that stuff. And, this is where you kind of get into technology and signal and all of the great advantages that we have. We've built something like 150 or 175 API connectors that allow you to come in and hook up this data signal very quickly, right? So, all we really need to do, we need to connect into your sales data. Obviously, if I'm going to measure lift on sales, we've got to be able to build that connection. So we set up an automated sales file that comes to us daily. We connect into a lot of those APIs and media vendors that I talk through. Like most of your media mix can basically be automated from publicly available reporting APIs that Google's and the Facebooks of the world offer. We get that set up. We work with you to do, look, we've got to understand your business and do some discovery and make sure that the data we're bringing in is being taxonomized and understood and putting in the marketing context with your strategy. But we can get that in, we can get that up and running. We actually deploy modeling against that so that we can understand in a data-driven way, hey, how is your marketing working? What's our initial view? We inform that, initially, like, look, we run thousands of tests all the time. That's actually a really informative data set to say, hey, what might I think your brand look like? Because we are working with brands that look like you. Not that you're going to work exactly the same, but hey, if I take a reasonable estimation of what you might look like, that's a good starting place. All of that happens within 30 days. Okay. And that gives you the ability to stand up a lot of capability really quickly and to get an initial view before you've ever run a test. And then right around that 30-day mark, we'll go through that. We'll mine that data for insights, and we'll start using that to build the learning agenda that I talked about, right? So those models that are really good out of the block because they're informed by a lot of intelligence and a lot of your data. Now I start putting those models on steroids by feeding them with tests and getting those tests out in market and getting them going, right? So the typical tests that we run, like I mentioned, are about 4 weeks. At the 30-day mark, you're ready to click, go, automate, push those out. So you've got a great capability at 30 days. And then about 2 months in, you're starting to see those test results roll in and you're off and running. So that's a lot different than the stuff that I was doing 10 and 15 years ago, where we might take 6 or 12 months just to get a data and modeling exercise stood up. I mean, there are nightmare stories about those that frankly still happen.
I remember from my my Criteo days, clients would say, we're gonna test Criteo, we're gonna test you, but we need to get our MTA in place first. And literally a year would go by and they were just like, what a painful process. It's still not working right. We're ripping them out. Like it was an awful process. Well, Nick, thank you for being in the Matrix. I think this was a really enlightening conversation. It probably raises more questions for people, but probably gives them a better starting point. I think generating hypotheses is probably a really good place to start. And I like what you were saying there at the end, use what you have available to generate hypothesis and then test and see. So I hope we can have you back on the show in the near future with Carter's or another client to take us through their own experience working with you in terms of expectations and deliverables. So until then, take care and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Sean. It's been a lot of fun.
Great, Nick. Appreciate it. See you later.
All right. Take care.
This episode of the MarTech Matrix was brought to you by the Cogent Collective, a community of marketing and e-commerce leaders. Learn more at cogentcollective.com. For show notes and information on upcoming episodes, head on over to the martechmatrix.com. If you would like to learn more about the companies appearing on this podcast and see if they're a good fit for your company, send Sean a note at sean@cogentcollective.com. New episodes of the MarTech Matrix podcast will drop every Monday, so be sure to subscribe with your favorite podcast network so you can stay on top of what's happening in the Matrix.